Okay, so this is going to be the first video of the neurological system, and this is going to be a nervous system review. So when we talk about the nervous system or the neurological system, we refer to those as both things. We are talking about the area of study that is related to the study of the neurological system, which we know is responsible for the communication and control that occurs within our body. It is made up of the nervous system, which we know is the body's connection to the environment. So, when we're dealing with the nervous system, the neurological system, we are dealing with lots of important things throughout our body. And really, without proper functioning of the nervous system, we have a lot of issues because we know that we are talking about cognition, the nervous system controlling cognition, which is our mental action or the process of acquiring knowledge and understanding our thoughts, experiences, and senses. We're also controlling mobility with our nervous system and then also controlling the sensory perception. So, lots of different areas that the nervous system controls within our body. When we talk about diseases within the nervous system, we're going to be talking about those diseases that are related to sensory, perception, or coordination problems. So, CVAs, cerebral vascular accidents, or stroke, Alzheimer's disease, seizures, head injury, multiple sclerosis. We'll talk about some spinal disorders. And we'll also discuss eye and ear disorders such as otitis media, glaucoma, and of course, there'll be lots of others. So, again, just those major functions of that nervous system is just to regulate and integrate all body functions, muscle movements, our senses, our mental abilities, and our emotions. There are two main divisions of the nervous system, and of course, there is an outline that is attached in Blackboard for this lecture, so hopefully you can follow along with that outline and keep up here with the PowerPoint as well. So there are two main divisions of the nervous system. There is the central nervous system, which contains the brain and the spinal cord. And we know that that kind of functions like a computer, but really more complex. And then there's also the peripheral nervous system, which contains the somatic nervous system and also the autonomic nervous system. So this is going to be all those nerves and neurons that are outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So within that somatic nervous system, it's going to be the system that contains the afferent or the sensory neurons and the efferent or motor neurons. And within that somatic system, there are spinal nerves, which there are 31 pair, and there are 12 pair of cranial nerves, and we'll talk more about those. And then the other portion of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, and we know then that that is broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. So the next thing we're going to talk about are the cells of the nervous system. So the first cell that we want to talk about is the neuron, and the neuron we know is kind of that basic unit or that basic cell of the nervous system. And those neurons are grouped in chains that form nerves. So their basic job is to carry messages to and from the central nervous system. So they transmit those impulses or those messages to and from the CNS. So on your picture or on your screen here, you can see just the figure of a basic neuron. And there's also some other pictures in your book. Pages 1863 to 1869 are basically the pages in your foundations book that's being covered for this section. So there are some effects that the neuron has. So when it is receiving messages, it can increase in action, so it has excitation, or they can decrease in action, which is what we refer to as inhibition. And you can see there again, just those major functions of the neuron are for mobility, sensory perception, and cognition. So the next thing we'll talk about are the different parts of the neuron. So there are, you can see up here on your screen as well, and I'll have another picture here in just a second. So the first part is what's referred to as the cell body. So the cell body is what contains the nucleus. It is essential for continued life of the neuron. And all of these are found in the brain and spinal cord. So that means that they are protected by bone. There also are dendrites, and there are many of these dendrites. And these are the extensions that carry impulses toward the cell body. And you can see those there on your screen. Those dendrites are kind of at the end of that neuron. Then there is what is referred to as the axon, and the axon is what transmits impulses away from the cell body. So there are also what is referred to as axon terminals, which is the end of the nerves, and you can see that to the right of the screen. Also, another picture here shows the axon terminals at the top of this picture on the left side, and then you can see the dendrites are on the right side at the ends of that where that nucleus is contained. So again, the dendrites are carrying impulses toward the cell body. The axons are transmitting impulses away from that cell body. Okay, there also is a synapse, and you can see the bottom picture here will show an example of the synapse, which is the space between the neurons. So this is when the axon must transmit an impulse to the dendrite or the cell body of another neuron. It must cross this small gap, and we refer to that sometimes that small gap as the synaptic cleft, which is that tiny space that separates those neurons. And again, those are they're very close, but they never touch. And so this picture here again kind of shows another example of what that synapse looks like. And then you see your axon, and then you see that synaptic cleft. So again, that's where neuron, the neuron is close to another neuron, but again, they never actually touch. And then the next thing are the neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are going to be chemicals that transfer impulses across a synapse. So they basically make sure that the neurological impulse passes from the nerve to the muscle. So that's kind of what those neurotransmitters are responsible for. There are excitatory neurotransmitters. There's also inhibitory neurotransmitters. So here you can see they're referred to as those chemical messengers, and each neuron produces a specific neurotransmitter. And then again, they can either enhance or they can inhibit the impulses. Okay, so this screen here is just going to show some examples of some neurotransmitters. There are lots of different neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is a real common neurotransmitter which works to speed up the nerve impulse transmission at the synapse. So that's kind of the basic thing that the acetylcholine is responsible for. And each of these neurotransmitters are responsible for different things, and that's why when we have neurological problems, most of the time there's a problem with the certain neurotransmitter, so therefore we have certain problems related to the miscommunication or the neurotransmitter not exactly working properly or the way that it's supposed to. Cholinesterase is another common neurotransmitter which works to break down and deactivate acetylcholine. Also helps to relax once the message has been sent. Norepinephrine is another common neurotransmitter you've probably heard of, and it is responsible for the regulation of mood, also dreaming, and awakening from deep sleep. And dopamine is responsible for gross skeletal muscle movement, also responsible for our emotional responses. So, for example, disorders such as Parkinson's disease, those patients tend to have low dopamine levels, so therefore they have tremors. So they can't control that gross skeletal muscle movement because of that decrease in dopamine. And the last one here, as an example, is serotonin, which controls mood, it induces sleep, and it controls temperature. So you probably remember a little bit of serotonin from mental health class. I'm talking about some of those. A lot of those mental health disorders have to do with low levels of serotonin. So we have a lot of problems with mood. So therefore, they take those medications that increase the serotonin levels. So there's more here on your screen, but those are just some common examples that are mentioned in your book. And again, you'll hear us talk about these neurotransmitters more as I go through the different disorders of the nervous system. Okay, the next thing listed there on your outline is, so we're still talking about parts of the neuron, is the neuron coverings. So there is a neuron covering called myelin. And sorry, I should have probably proceeded to this screen when I was talking about the neurotransmitters, but this again just kind of shows some examples of those neurotransmitters. And again, the main thing with those neurotransmitters is that they balance. So, for example, acetylcholine and dopamine, sometimes they work together, but if one is off, then that can lead to symptoms that may resemble something like Parkinson's. With myasthenia gravis, we'll talk about that. There's usually a decrease in acetylcholine. So we'll talk about that again. But this just kind of shows again where those neurotransmitters are, where they cross, and then kind of where that synapse is. Okay, so now we'll talk about the neuron covering. So the first one is what is referred to as the myelin or the myelin sheath. So myelin is a white, waxy covering that increases the speed of nerve impulses and it protects fibers. So myelin plays a major role in multiple sclerosis and also Guillain-Barré syndrome. So when we talk about those, we'll talk about the myelin. So it's that white lipid covering or white matter. And you can see there, the right of your screen, the myelin sheath there that's covering those axons. So there also are gaps between the myelin, and those are called the nodes of Ranvier, and those play a major role in impulse conduction. So if that myelin is impaired, which is what happens in multiple sclerosis, also Guillain-Barré, then that can lead to those impulses not traveling correctly, and that's where you get those some of those symptoms of decreased nerve conduction. So they have the weakness, the tingling, and things like that, because basically what happens is there's demyelination. So the antibodies will attack those Schwann cells, which you see there on the screen, and then that causes demyelination or breaking down of that sheath. So again, therefore, the myelin's impaired, those impulses can't travel correctly, that will interrupt that nerve conduction, and that's where they get those symptoms. So mostly, again, neurological in nature, the weakness, the tingling, the numbness a lot of times. And of course, we'll talk more about that with those disease processes. And the last one there under nerve coverings is what is called the neurolema. That is spelled Neurilema, the neurolema. And basically, the neurolema is a covering that occurs only in the peripheral nerve fibers. So it's a covering that only occurs in the peripheral nerve fibers. And so basically, the Schwann cells produce this layer. They produce this neurolema in that peripheral nervous system. And this has to do with the regeneration of damaged nerve fibers. The regeneration of damaged nerve fibers. So if those axons have been injured, this neurolema can help to regenerate those damaged nerve fibers. But that's only in the peripheral nervous system. Now, the central nervous system does not have this layer. They do not have this neurolema. So therefore, cells that are damaged within the central nervous system results in permanent damage. So for example, paralysis. When paralysis occurs, that is permanent because this neurolema is not present in those cells and therefore cannot be reversed. So they're damaged for good. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about are some different types of neurons. So there are mostly two common neurons. There is the sensory neuron, or you see here it's a sensory nerve that we refer to as the afferent nerve also. You'll hear that called the afferent neuron or afferent nerve. And basically what the sensory nerve does is it senses stimuli and it carries impulses from the periphery to the central nervous system. Okay, so some examples of those neurons that send those signals are like from the senses. the skin, the muscles, and the internal organs. Okay, so those sensory neurons. And they send that impulse to the central nervous system. Your motor neurons, or your efferent nerves or efferent neurons, these are going to be the ones that they actually produce work. So they stimulate an action, and that will carry those impulses from the central nervous system to the periphery. So they're carrying that motor information from the brain to the actual peripheral nervous system. Okay, so just kind of know the difference in what those nerves do. And then there's also the central neuron, which is located within the spinal cord, and it's there to interpret the message. So your sensory neuron receives info, sends the impulse to the spinal cord. That central neuron's kind of in the middle where it interprets the impulse. And then you have your motor neuron, which is responsible for sending the message back to the muscle or the organ that is involved. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is we'll break down the two systems, and we'll talk about the central nervous system first. Okay, so the first division of the nervous system, the central nervous system. So it is kind of that main network of coordination and control for the body. So it's kind of that main function of that central nervous system. And we know that the central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord. So within that brain, we know that the blood flow to the brain is via that vertebral and carotid artery, and then it flows back to the heart via the jugular veins. Now, hopefully, you've had cardiac, and some of this will be a review related to that flow to the brain, that blood flow, related to the heart. So the blood flow to the brain, it flows to the brain via those vertebral and carotid arteries, and then it flows back to the heart via those jugular veins. So again, just kind of reviewing that there, just so that you can understand the way that the blood flows. Now, the brain is protected, of course, by by bone, which is the cranium and the skull, and then also the meninges. Okay, so the meninges and the membranes cover the brain and the spinal cord. Now, of course, within those meninges, we know that there are 3 layers of protective coverings, and there's also a page in your book that will also show this picture or similar picture. So you have your outermost layer, which is referred to as the dura mater. So the dura mater is going to be that outermost layer. It's going to be directly under the skull. It's a very tough layer. And so this helps to kind of know these layers when we talk about subdural and epidural hematomas. So, for example, subdural would mean below. So that would be a hematoma below that dura. And then epidural would mean above the dura. So we would be talking about a hematoma above that layer. So again, when we talk about those hematomas, you'll hear these terms again. Then there is the arachnoid layer, which is that second layer, and it's going to contain the blood vessels. And then that third layer, that innermost layer, is referred to as the pia mater. Okay, so it's that innermost layer, very thin, very tender, and it provides oxygen and nourishment to the nervous tissue. Now, just a note, between that arachnoid and that pia mater is where we have a space that's referred to as the subarachnoid space. And that's going to contain the cerebral spinal fluid, which resembles plasma, and that acts as a protective cushion for the brain and the spinal cord from impact. And then it also aids in exchange of nutrients and waste. So there's protein, glucose, urea, and salts that are contained within that cerebral spinal fluid. And then also it contains that blood-brain barrier, which helps to prevent harmful substances from entering the brain and the spinal cord. So that cerebral spinal fluid kind of works as providing protection as well for the brain. Okay, so the there's 4 main parts of the brain, or what we refer to as principal parts of the brain. So you have your cerebrum, which is going to be that largest part. Okay, and then that cerebrum is divided into left and right hemispheres. And we know that each of those hemispheres receive sensory information from the opposite side of the body, and then it controls the skeletal muscle of the opposite side. So if you have a stroke, or an occlusion on the right hemisphere, then the effects are going to be noted on the left side of the person's body. So it works opposite. So within that cerebrum, then that cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes, and those are going to be named after the cranial bones that actually cover them or lie over the top of them. Again, there's a picture in your book as well. So just quickly, we'll kind of go through what each of these lobes are. So the first lobe is the frontal lobe, and we know that it is responsible for the written speech or the ability to write, also motor speech or the ability to talk. There is Broca's area of speech in this area, and that can cause expressive aphasia, for example, if there's an injury at this area. Also, the frontal lobe is responsible for motor ability, so it directs movement of the body. Again, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and then vice versa. Also, intellectualization, so the ability to be able to form concepts or to think, and judgment formation. So our morals, our emotional response, our short-term memory are also responsible in that frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is the next lobe, and that is primarily responsible. It contains that primary sensory cortex, so it contains that sensory area. So those impulses from the skin, such as touch, pain, temperature, also the ability to be able to recognize body parts, the ability to determine the right from the left, the determination of shapes, sizes, and distances also contained in that parietal lobe. The temporal lobe is the next one, which is kind of our memory storage. So it's responsible for long-term memory. Also, it contains sensory areas for hearing, smelling, and taste. Also, balance. Wernicke's area is also located here, which is has to deal with language comprehension. So if it's damaged in the dominant hemisphere, then the person can have what's called receptive aphasia, which is where they can hear the words, but they have no meaning to them. So they have a hard time receiving that information and being able to understand it. And the fourth lobe is the occipital lobe, which contains the visual area. That's the main thing we think of with the occipital lobe, is that visual area. Also, understanding of the written word. So we are able to see and then also interpret what is being seen. Okay, so that was the cerebrum. So going back to this picture here, you see the cerebrum down the front side. And again, just an overview here, a review of these parts of the brain so that you know if there's an area of that part of the brain that's injured or affected, then you know what to expect to see where those decreases in that patient's ability may be. So then there's also the diencephalon, which you see there on the left side of the screen, and then the brainstem and the cerebellum. So we'll talk about those next. Okay, so the diencephalon is the next part of the brain, and this is going to be the interbrain, which lies beneath the cerebrum, and then it's going to contain that thalamus, the hypothalamus, and also what's called the epithalamus. So we're just going to talk about the main two. So your thalamus is kind of your relay station for sensory impulses to other parts of the brain. Also, it interprets other sensory messages such as pain, also light touch and pressure. And then there's also the hypothalamus, which most commonly we know controls our body temperature. It also works to control fluid balance, our appetite, certain emotions, so fear, pleasure, and pain specifically, also our sleep, also controls the autonomic nervous system, and it's responsible for the production of hormones, which are secreted by the pituitary gland. So therefore, that influences our heart rate, the contraction and relaxation of the blood vessels, hormone secretions, and others as well. The next area of the brain is the cerebellum, of the cerebrum. We're still talking about, the diencephalon. This is the third part, the cerebellum. Sorry, I had it right the first time. So the cerebellum, you can see there on your screen, functions in the coordination of skeletal muscle contractions and also in the maintenance of normal muscle tone, posture, and balance. So kind of that equilibrium. So your cerebellum is going to be that second largest portion of the brain. So again, we know all areas of the brain important, the cerebrum being the largest, but the cerebellum being the second largest. A lot of skeletal muscle contractions, coordination, balance, so a very important part. And the fourth part is the brain stem. And so the brain stem is going to connect the brain with the spinal cord. So it's going to be located at the base of the brain. And within the brain stem, there is the midbrain, there is the pons, and there's also the medulla oblongata. So your midbrain is going to be what regulates the visual and auditory reflexes. So if you have damage here, that can lead to reflex and eye movement problems. The pons is what is going to control respirations. So the injuries here are very serious because it can actually cause respiratory arrest. And the medulla oblongata is what controls the rate and strength of the heartbeat, also controls the rate and depth of respirations, the diameter of the blood vessels, also controls swallowing, coughing, sneezing, vomiting, and hiccups. So again, injury to the medulla oblongata area, the brain stem, is typically fatal immediately. So injury there is very, very serious. And the last portion of the brainstem, which is on your screen, but it's just the ventricles. So your ventricles are basically just going to be those cavities that are located in the brain, and they contain that cerebral spinal fluid.